The orchestra was not supposed to stop. Every musician on that stage had trained their entire life never to break mid-performance. Not for emotion, not for surprise, not for anything. Yet that night, something unthinkable happened. Violins slowly lowered. Cellos stopped vibrating. A conductor froze mid-gesture. One by one, Europe's finest musicians let their instruments fall silent. Not because of a mistake, but because a single voice had entered the room. At the center of the stage stood a young Filipino man, hands trembling, breath uneven, singing a Christmas song most of the audience had never heard. By the second verse, people were crying, and no one understood why. To understand how a song from a small tropical country silenced one of Europe's greatest orchestras, we have to return to a place no concert hall ever looks. His name was Daniel Cruz. He grew up in a narrow coastal neighborhood in the Philippines, where the air always smelled faintly of salt and rust, and the wind carried the sound of waves mixed with engines and distant voices. The sea was never far, but it was never generous either. It fed some families and swallowed others. Every house knew that truth. When it rained, the streets disappeared under shallow water, turning cracked concrete into mirrors that reflected flickering streetlights and passing clouds. Children learned early how to step carefully, how to balance on stones, how to keep moving even when the ground beneath them shifted. Christmas there didn't feel magical. It felt necessary. It wasn't about wrapped gifts or glowing trees. It was about stretching what little there was, about making enough food last, about choosing what could be celebrated and what had to wait. Food mattered more than decorations. Work mattered more than wishes. Lights were reused from years before. Paper lanterns were patched and hung again. Laughter was real, but it never drowned out the quiet calculations happening in every household. Daniel's grandmother sang while she worked. She sang while cooking over a small stove, stirring rice and coconut, wrapping sticky rice cakes in banana leaves worn thin from use. She sang while hanging lanterns made from recycled paper, their colors uneven but carefully chosen. She sang not to perform and not to impress, but to remember. Her voice wasn't trained. It cracked sometimes. It wandered off key. But it carried history. It carried mornings before sunrise, and nights when the power went out. It carried stories of people who had left, and people who never could. It carried a kind of patience that only comes from having survived long enough to stop explaining yourself. Daniel would sit quietly nearby, often on the floor, his back against the wall, listening. He didn't hum along. He didn't ask questions. He didn't interrupt. He listened the way people listen when they're afraid a sound might disappear if they move too much. Not because the singing was beautiful, but because it felt true. And even as a child, Daniel understood something he couldn't yet explain, that truth, when carried in a voice, can last longer than comfort, longer than money, longer than time. By the time Daniel was 12, he was singing outside small neighborhood stores during December nights. The air was cooler then, heavy with the smell of fried food, damp concrete, and the faint sweetness of sugar and smoke. Christmas lights flickered above shelves packed with instant noodles and canned goods. Radios played old holiday songs on low volume, competing with passing tricycles and distant laughter. Daniel would stand near the doorway, holding a worn guitar almost as big as he was, his fingers stiff from the cold. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask for attention. He just sang. People slowed their steps. Some stopped completely. Others pretended not to, but stayed close enough to hear. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They just listened. Mothers paused with grocery bags cutting into their hands. Vendors leaned against counters. A few tired workers closed their eyes for a moment longer than necessary, as if giving themselves permission to rest. Some left coins in a small tin. Others left nothing but silence. But the silence was never empty. Once, an old man sitting on a plastic chair outside the store looked up at Daniel and said quietly, "Don't waste that voice." Daniel smiled politely. He didn't argue. He didn't promise anything, because even then he already knew the truth. Voices don't pay rent. Songs don't buy rice. By 16, Daniel stopped singing in public. It felt safer to keep his voice to himself. By 18, he stopped believing it mattered at all. And the streets, once filled with his quiet songs, learned to pass December nights without him. At 20, Daniel worked nights as a janitor at the Manila Performing Arts Center. While the city slept, he arrived through the side entrance, signing his name on a clipboard under flickering fluorescent lights. His uniform was always a size too big, the fabric thin from years of use. He tied his apron carefully, as if neatness might earn him a place he knew he didn't have. He cleaned floors where orchestras rehearsed during the day. Floors polished so perfectly they reflected chandeliers and stage lights like still water. Every swipe of his mop echoed through the vast halls, the sound bouncing back at him, louder in the emptiness. He emptied bins filled with sheet music he couldn't read. Pages covered in symbols and lines meant nothing to him, yet he handled them gently, smoothing bent corners before folding them away. He knew those markings mattered to someone, just not to him. Music surrounded him. It leaked from rehearsal rooms left ajar. It drifted through corridors long after musicians had gone home. Sometimes a single note lingered in the air, hanging like a question no one planned to answer. But it wasn't for him. He stayed in the background. He moved quietly. He learned which paths kept him unseen. Daniel learned to be invisible, not out of bitterness but out of habit. In a place built for sound, silence was his role. Until one stormy night, when the rain came down hard enough to rattle the windows, and the power went out. And for the first time, the building went quiet in a way Daniel had never heard before. The building was dark, not the kind of darkness that feels empty, but the kind that listens back. Only the emergency lights glowed, casting long, pale streaks across the stage. Shadows stretched where music usually lived. The vast hall felt larger without sound, as if it were holding its breath. Daniel mopped the stage slowly, the soft splash of water echoing with every step. Each movement sounded louder than it should have. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight, responding in small, tired sighs. That was when he noticed it. In the far corner of the stage stood an old upright piano, its finish cracked, its keys yellowed with age. It had been pushed aside, forgotten, like something no one expected to be useful again. Dust clung to its surface. A few keys leaned slightly out of place. Daniel paused. He didn't know why he walked toward it. He didn't know why he stopped mopping. He sat down slowly, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. He pressed a key. The sound was uneven, soft, but alive. He pressed another, then another. A melody began to rise. Hesitant at first, as though unsure it was welcome. It was a Christmas song his grandmother used to hum while hanging lanterns, her voice blending with the clatter of dishes and the distant sound of rain. Without planning to, Daniel sang. Quiet at first, almost apologetic, then deeper. His voice carried years he had never spoken aloud. Long nights, swallowed dreams, words he had learned to keep to himself. The sound traveled upward, filling the empty hall, touching balconies and walls that had not heard a human voice all night. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him. He didn't see the tall man standing still in the shadows, listening. He only stopped when a voice, gentle, careful not to break the moment, said, "Please, Sing that again." The man stepped forward into the dim light and introduced himself quietly, a European conductor visiting Manila for a series of rehearsals. His accent was unmistakable, his posture careful. His presence carried a calm authority that came not from volume, but from certainty. He didn't wear a tuxedo or carry a baton, just a long coat, slightly damp from the rain, and eyes that had spent a lifetime listening. He didn't ask Daniel where he studied. He didn't ask who taught him to sing. He didn't ask about conservatories, competitions, or credentials. Those questions could wait. Instead, he asked only one thing. "Why are you hiding that voice?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then answered honestly, without rehearsal, without pride. "Because I'm nobody." The words came out smaller than he intended, as if they had been waiting a long time to be said. The conductor studied him for a moment, not critically, not skeptically, but the way one studies something rare, afraid to name it too quickly. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You've misunderstood." Daniel looked up. "Music doesn't belong to somebody," the conductor continued. "It belongs to whoever carries it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain further. He simply waited. The silence stretched. Not awkward, but heavy with possibility. Daniel swallowed, his hands trembling slightly as he turned back to the piano. He sang again. This time, without apology. And as the final note faded into the darkened hall, the conductor lifted a hand to his face. He was crying. Not from surprise, not from nostalgia, but from recognition. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It wasn't slipped under the door or handed over casually. It was delivered carefully, as if the person carrying it understood it mattered. The envelope was thick, the paper heavier than anything Daniel had ever held. A seal of dark red wax marked the back, unbroken, deliberate. Daniel turned it over in his hands, unsure what to do with it. When he opened it, his fingers trembled. Inside was an invitation, not a suggestion, not a test. An invitation to sing at a Christmas concert in Europe. Daniel read the words again, then again. The letters stayed the same. His chest tightened, not with excitement but with disbelief. He didn't own a suit. He didn't have a passport. He had never left the country, not even once. He didn't know how people spoke there. He didn't know how winter felt. He didn't know how someone like him was supposed to belong on a stage like that. He handed the letter to his grandmother without saying a word. She read it slowly, lips moving with each line, careful not to rush what the moment was becoming. When she finished, she folded the letter neatly, edge to edge, as if returning something precious to its place. Then she looked at him. Her voice was steady, certain. "When the world opens a door," she said, "don't ask why." She placed the folded letter back into his hands. "Walk through it." Vienna was freezing, not just cold, but sharp, the kind of cold that bit through borrowed coats and made every breath feel thin and unfamiliar. Daniel's fingers stiffened the moment he stepped outside. His lungs burned each time he inhaled, as if the air itself was testing whether he belonged there. The city felt older than anything he had ever known. Stone buildings stood heavy with history. Church bells echoed through narrow streets. Snow gathered quietly on rooftops and window ledges, softening the edges of a place built to endure centuries. The concert hall was enormous. Its doors were tall, enough to swallow sound. Inside, gold lined the walls, ornate, deliberate, unmoving. Chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above rows of velvet seats. Every surface seemed to remember applause, judgment, and silence all at once. Gold, history, expectation. The orchestra watched him carefully as he walked onto the stage for rehearsal. Some faces held curiosity. others doubt. Their eyes lingered, not cruelly but cautiously. A Filipino Christmas song. In Tagalog? Here? Daniel felt their questions without anyone speaking them. He practiced until his voice cracked. He repeated passages until his throat burned and his chest ached. He learned when to pull back, when to let silence breathe, when to trust the space between notes. The conductor guided him patiently, shaping not just sound, but restraint. Still, doubt followed him. It waited backstage. It stood beside him under the lights. It whispered as he stepped forward. And even as he took his place on the stage built for legends, Daniel wondered, quietly, desperately, if a song from home could survive the weight of a hall like this. December 24th. Outside, snow drifted softly through the streets, settling on stone and glass like a quiet promise. Inside the concert hall, every seat was filled. Diplomats, patrons, journalists, music lovers who had come expecting precision, tradition, and perfection. The lights dimmed. One by one, the edges of the hall disappeared into shadow until only the stage remained. And at its center stood Daniel, alone beneath a single spotlight. The air felt heavier now. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered home. Rain tapping on tin roofs, lanterns swaying in narrow alleys, his grandmother's voice humming while she worked, never asking to be heard. He opened his mouth. Then he sang. The first notes trembled. They were fragile, almost uncertain, like a candle struggling against wind. His breath wavered, his hands tightened, and for a moment it felt as though the sound might disappear before it could reach the back of the hall. But it didn't. The notes steadied. They found their shape. The orchestra followed gently, carefully, as if stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Violins lifted softly. Cellos breathed beneath the melody. Woodwinds echoed rhythms that carried the quiet heartbeat of a distant shore. Then something broke. Not a rule, not a structure. A barrier. Audience members wiped tears they didn't remember forming. Hands shook against armrests. Breaths caught in throats trained to remain composed. A single sob escaped. Then another. And then the unthinkable happened. The orchestra stopped playing. Not from confusion, not from error, from awe. One by one, musicians lowered their instruments, choosing silence over sound. They wanted to hear only him, only the voice carrying memory, distance, and truth across continents. Daniel didn't notice. He was somewhere else. And in that suspended moment, an entire hall listened, not to music, but to something far rarer, something real. When Daniel finished, the final note did not fall away. It hovered, suspended in the air like something afraid to leave. The hall did not clap. It stayed silent. Not an awkward silence, not a confused one. A full silence. The kind that settles into a room only when something sacred has passed through it. When people are afraid that making noise might break what they are still trying to understand. No one shifted in their seat. No one cleared their throat. Hands rested over hearts. Eyes stayed closed. Time seemed to slow, then stop. Daniel stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling, unsure whether he had done something extraordinary or made a terrible mistake. The spotlight felt warmer now, heavier, as if it were waiting for permission to let go. Then, somewhere in the back of the hall, a single pair of hands came together. Once, twice. And suddenly the room erupted. The applause was not polite, not measured, not restrained. It was long, shaking, unstoppable, the kind that rolls forward like a wave, filling every corner, pressing against walls built to contain sound. People stood without thinking. Some cried openly. Others clapped with their eyes closed, as if afraid the moment might disappear if they looked too closely. Backstage, Daniel could barely breathe. Musicians approached him slowly. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. They nodded. They bowed. Some placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture that said more than words ever could. The conductor stepped forward last. His voice was low, almost reverent, as if still standing inside the silence that came before the applause. "You didn't perform," he whispered. Daniel looked up, uncertain. "You reminded us." The conductor continued softly, "Why music exists." And for the first time that night, Daniel understood. Not every song is meant to impress. Some are meant to return something the world has forgotten how to feel. Daniel learned the truth days later, not from headlines, not from interviews, but in a quiet conversation, spoken slowly, as if the story itself needed care. The conductor explained that decades earlier, a Filipino immigrant had arrived in Europe carrying little more than memory and music. He had worked quietly alongside musicians, sharing melodies from home, songs shaped by longing, by distance, by the ache of belonging somewhere far away. One of those melodies was the Christmas song Daniel sang. For a brief time, it lived in the concert hall. Then it faded. The immigrant returned home, or disappeared into history. The song was set aside, replaced by newer compositions, newer traditions. Over time, it became just another note lost between generations. Until now, until a voice carried it back exactly as it had been meant to be heard. When Daniel returned home, the air felt warmer, heavier, familiar. The streets smelled like rain and food and life. Everything moved faster and slower at the same time. His grandmother was waiting. She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away tears he hadn't realized were there. She looked at him the way she always had, without surprise, without pride, only understanding. "Music finds its way back," she said softly. And in that moment, Daniel knew the journey had never really been about Europe. It had been about a song remembering where it came from and finding its way home. They didn't stop for perfection. They stopped for memory, for honesty, for something real. Because sometimes one voice is enough to remind the world how to feel.